Okay, let's start today's deep dive in a place we probably all know a bit too well.
Yeah.
That counter at your local coffee shop. You've just ordered, I don't know, a $7 latte, you tap your card, and then that tablet computer, the point of sale thing, it swivels around. And that screen is staring back at you, demanding 20%, 22%, maybe 25%. Or there's that tiny, almost hidden button, no tip or custom. That feels loaded.
That exact moment, yeah, that kind of blend of frustration, maybe a bit of social pressure. It perfectly captures what's going on with American service culture right now. It feels like we're constantly being asked to tip more often for higher amounts. And yeah, in situations where, frankly, tipping just wasn't really a thing a few years back. We're definitely living through tipflation, and it's often driven by what some people are calling guilt tipping.
Absolutely. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to try and simplify this really complex, sometimes pretty emotionally charged system. We're going to use the Feynman technique.
Yeah.
So we need to unpack how tipping works now, explain the forces behind it, technology, wages, policy that let this whole culture kind of spread.
Yeah.
And really crucially, try to understand why fixing this mess, because it is a mess, is so incredibly hard for everyone involved. Workers, businesses, us as consumers.
The tension is just, you can feel it, can't you? On one side, you've got consumers who are genuinely pretty angry about it. I saw a bank rate survey from 2023, and it found that, wow, 66% of American adults now have a negative view of tipping. That's huge. People feel like they're being manipulated, nickel and dimed constantly, and often they're just confused about where the money is actually ending up.
But then there's the flip side. If you hit that no tip button, you might think you're sticking it to some big corporation, but you might actually be hurting the person standing right in front of you. Because for so many service workers, they genuinely rely on that money to pay their bills.
Precisely. So many service workers are caught in the sub-minimum wage structure. For them, tips aren't some kind of nice bonus. They're the actual foundation of their income. So this small transaction that used to feel optional, it's become this sort of proxy battleground. It reflects wider frustrations about the economy, about inflation, about wage policies that maybe aren't working, and sometimes, yeah, just outright business manipulation. We're looking at an issue with really no easy answers, no solution that makes everyone happy.
Okay, so let's really get into it. Following that Feynman idea, we need simple, clear definitions first. Let's break down the basics. What was tipping originally meant for compared to what the system is kind of twisted into today?
Well, historically, tipping was supposed to be this voluntary bonus. It was meant to reward genuinely good, maybe exceptional service, mostly in places like full-service restaurants where you had a dedicated server. It gave the customer some agency, They could directly reward quality. It was seen, I guess, as a way for customers to sort of share in the labor cost, but only after getting good service. It wasn't built in.
Right. But the game changer, the thing that really warps this in the U.S., is the tipped minimum wage, that specific piece of labor law. For anyone who isn't deep into labor policy, could you just explain simply how that core mechanism works?
Yeah, it's fundamental. The system basically allows employers to shift a big chunk of their payroll costs off their books. In many parts of the U.S. legally, an employer can pay a worker a much lower cash wage. Federally, that number's been stuck at just $2.13 an hour for, decades now. The rule is the tips the worker earns must then make up the difference between that $2.13 and whatever the full standard minimum wage is in that area, which federally is $7.25, but many states have much higher minimums now.
Okay, so the idea is if the tips don't reach that full minimum wage level, the employer has to legally make up the difference. But the sources we looked at suggest this often means employers just don't have much reason to raise that cash wage above the absolute minimum required, do they?
Exactly. And here's where it gets really insidious. The part of the trap that a lot of consumers maybe don't realize, the tax side of it. So if a worker's earning that $2.19 an hour and they report their tips, which legally they have to their payroll taxes like FICA, Social Security, Medicare, they're calculated based on their total reported income. That's the cash wage plus all the tips. Now, in states with low minimum wages, that worker's actual cash paycheck from the employer, the $2.13 part, often isn't even enough to cover the taxes owed on their combined income.
Wait, hang on. So you're saying the worker could get a paycheck that's $0 or even shows they owe money?
Yes, it happens. The way the taxes are deducted means the only actual cash the worker might take home is the tips they receive directly from customers. If they were relying just on that $2.13 wage on paper, after taxes on their total earnings are calculated, they could effectively be paying to work that shift. This structure legally locks in the worker's total dependence on customer tips. It transforms tipping from this idea of a bonus into a kind of mandatory wage subsidy, but one that's enforced by the tax code and labor law, not just social pressure.
Wow. Okay, that structure really sets the stage perfectly for tipflation to just take off. That aggressive push for more tips more often. So let's look at the three main drivers that really push this model into overdrive.
Right. The most obvious one, the one we all see every day, is technology. Those digital payment tablets, the apps. They didn't just make tipping easier, they fundamentally changed the psychology. They standardized it, they amplified the pressure. They often default to much higher percentages starting at 18%, 20%, 25% is common now. And critically, they got rid of the passive nature of just walking past a physical tip jar.
Yeah, it makes not tipping a very active, visible choice you have to make.
Exactly. You physically have to tap no tip or go into custom amount and type 0. Often while the employee is right there, maybe even watching you do it, it turns it into this visible, sometimes pretty awkward social interaction. That visibility, that awkwardness, that is the engine driving a lot of guilt tipping.
Okay, driver number two you mentioned relates to something more recent. The pandemic shifts.
Yeah, during the early days of COVID, remember that, there was this real genuine outpouring of support from consumers. People were actively, sometimes even happily, tipping way more than usual to support essential workers, folks who were really putting themselves on the line, hazard pay sentiment.
Mm.
Businesses definitely noticed this. They saw people were willing to tip more, and frankly, some weaponized it. They made their payment prompts more aggressive, trying to use that customer generosity to stabilize their own payrolls, even long after that initial hero pay feeling started to fade.
And the third driver loops right back to that $2.13 an hour issue. The wage structures themselves, and specifically how businesses kind of use them to their advantage.
Businesses use the tipped minimum wage system strategically. It gives them a really powerful competitive edge. It lets them keep their advertised menu prices lower by essentially outsourcing, say, 15% to 20% of their actual labor cost directly onto the customer via the expected tip. Their menu looks cheaper. They seem more affordable than a competitor who might adopt a service-included model and has to bake the full cost of labor into their listed prices. It's become a core strategy, favoring that low initial sticker price.
Okay, but this is where we need to look at the data versus what people feel is happening. Because consumers definitely feel like tipping percentages themselves have just gone through the roof.
Yeah, the feeling is strong, but the data, especially from big payment processors like Square and Toast, it paints a slightly different picture. If you look at traditional full-service sit-down restaurants, the actual average tip percentage has been surprisingly stable. It's hovering in that high teens, low 20s range, think 19.5% to maybe 21%. That's been the norm for quite a while. So the perceived explosion isn't really in the percentage you leave for your server after a meal. It's mostly about the frequency.
Ah, so it's
Yeah.
about being prompted to tip in all these new places where we never used to. Like grabbing takeout, a coffee, a pre-made sandwich, sometimes even at a self-checkout kiosk.
Exactly that. The total amount consumers are spending on tips has gone up significantly, but it's mainly because the number of times we're asked to tip has skyrocketed. It's not necessarily that the standard 20% for a server has become 30%, it's that you're now being asked for 20% on things you never tipped on before. And interestingly, Square's data also notes that while service worker pay has increased overall in recent years, most of that growth actually comes from states and cities raising their base minimum wage, not from some massive jump in the average tip percentage itself.
Okay, that brings us to this really interesting economic paradox you mentioned earlier. We tend to think, okay, when I tip, I'm being generous. I am helping the business owner cover their payroll.
Right, that's the common perception. But what's really fascinating, if you dig into the economic modeling behind it, is that many experts argue the tipper isn't really subsidizing the business owner as much as they're subsidizing other consumers. This is a pretty critical point to grasp, because the whole tipping structure allows the restaurant to keep its menu prices artificially low, right? That lower sticker price attracts customers who are more price sensitive, people who might choose not to eat there if the menu price was 20% higher to include service.
So wait, the customer like me, who consistently tips 20%, I'm essentially making the meal cheaper for the customer next to me who might only tip 10%, or maybe nothing at all. And at the same time, I'm helping the business keep its listed prices down so it can attract more customers overall.
That's exactly the argument. If the business switched to a service-included model, say they charge $24 for that entree instead of $20 plus an expected $4 tip. Well, the generous tipper pays the same $24 either way. But that price-sensitive customer, the one attracted by the $20 price tag, they might now decide $24 is too much and go somewhere else. So in a way, the regular 20% tipper is subsidizing the market's price sensitivity. They're helping the business maximize its customer base and revenue by masking the true cost behind that lower initial price. It's clever in a way.
That whole idea of using tips to manipulate the perceived price. It leads us perfectly into some concrete examples of how businesses really leverage this. Let's dig into this concept called price partitioning. You mentioned it earlier. Can we use an analogy to really clarify how it works?
Yeah, price partitioning is a classic move in marketing, playing on how our brains work. It's about breaking down what's really one single total cost into multiple parts. You present a lower, much more attractive base price first, and then you add on other mandatory or maybe just highly expected fees later. Our brains tend to latch on to that first lower number. It's called anchoring bias, and it makes the whole transaction feel cheaper, even if the final cost adds up to be the same or even more.
Okay, and the sources we read drew a really clear line to budget airlines. Specifically, that Ryanair model became kind of infamous for this, right? How does that work as a parallel?
Oh, Ryanair basically perfected this. They'd advertise these unbelievably low base fares, like $40 for a flight between countries in Europe. Meanwhile, their competitor might be advertising, say, $100, but that's the all-in price. Immediately, your brain says, wow, Ryanair is 60% cheaper. But then, as soon as you start the booking, bam, 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 there's a charge for your checked bag. Oh, wait, there's also a charge for your carry-on bag. Need to print your boarding pass at the airport. That's a fee. Want to choose your seat? Fee.
So by the time you're done, the final price might actually be $110, maybe even more than the competitor. But that initial $40 anchor, it already did its job psychologically.
Precisely. Now, apply that exact logic to restaurants or coffee shops using tipping. The tip functions just like those airline fees. The restaurant shows you the lower base fare, that's the menu price. They know that the extra cost of labor, which is like the seat selection or bag fees, will mostly be covered by that expected 20% tip later on. So that $20 entree just looks way more appealing on the menu than the competitor down the street who's honest up front and lists it at $24 because they include service, even if you end up paying $24 at both places.
And the sources pointed out this tactic is especially effective for certain kinds of purchases, didn't they?
Yes, they mentioned hedonistic purchases. Think things like maybe fancy takeout you don't really need, specialty coffees, ice cream, things that feel like a treat or an indulgence. Often, consumers feel a little bit of guilt or friction about spending money on these non-essential items anyway, and this makes them sort of subconsciously more susceptible to just going along with the suggested tip. The partitioned pricing makes the initial cost of the indulgence seem lower, reducing that friction, making it easier to justify the treat and the subsequent tip.
Wow. Okay, so if using tips can be kind of manipulative just in setting menu prices, it can apparently be weaponized in a much more cynical way by tech companies. Let's get into that really striking case study, the Dave Banking app. What happened there?
Oh, Dave Case is it's a perfect, if pretty depressing example of tipping being completely detached from any kind of service and just used as a raw corporate revenue stream. So Dave is this banking app, and one of its main features is offering short-term cash advances, basically like small payday loans to tide people over. And they advertised it as having no interest charges.
Which sounds great on the surface, almost like a public service.
Yeah, sounds helpful, right? But it was far from it. The Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, investigated them, and they found that Dave collected nearly $150 million just between 2022 and mid-2024, almost entirely through an optional 15% tip that was added onto the loan repayment amount. And this tip was presented in really manipulative ways. Often it was hidden or maybe pre-selected by default, making it super difficult for users who are likely already in a tight spot financially to even realize they were paying it or to opt out.
And they used a particularly nasty psychological trick to pressure people into just leaving that 15% tip selected, didn't they?
This is where it really hits a low point for guilt-tipping tactics. They actually used this visual prompt on the app screen when you went to adjust the tip. As the user tried to slide the tip percentage down from the default 15% towards zero, a little cartoon image of a young girl's plate filled with food would visually shrink. So as you lowered the tip, her plate got emptier and emptier until it was completely empty if you selected 0%.
Oh my God. The direct implication being, if you don't give us this 15% tip, you are literally taking food out of the mouth of a starving child.
It was incredibly aggressive, direct emotional manipulation. It basically equated opting out of what was essentially a hidden corporate fee with being actively cruel to children in need. And the real kicker, The FTC investigation found that only a tiny, almost negligible fraction of all that tip money Dave collected actually went to any charity at all. The vast, vast majority went straight into the pockets of this multi-billion-dollar corporation. It's just
Yeah.
tipping weaponized as pure financial exploitation wrapped in this thin disguise of social good.
That is genuinely cynical.
Okay.
So we need to shift from that kind of corporate exploitation back to the really tough spot the workers themselves are in that sub-minimum wage trap we talked about earlier.
Yeah, because when you're talking about workers in states where that cash wage really is just $2.13 an hour, tips aren't a safety net. They're the entire tightrope they're walking on. The system basically forces them into this constant transactional negotiation with every single customer. Their ability to pay rent, buy groceries, it's entirely at the mercy of the customer's mood that day, their generosity, maybe just how much cash they have on them. If they have a slow night, or if a few customers decide they don't like the server's attitude, or maybe based on some bias, that worker could genuinely end a shift, having earned negative income after taxes are factored in. It's incredibly precarious.
And this kind of impossible pressure, it sometimes boils over into actual confrontation, doesn't it? Especially in some of those lower wage, maybe less traditional jobs like in the gig economy.
Absolutely. There was that DoorDash driver incident that went kind of viral. A driver was caught on camera stealing a customer's $20 pizza. Why? Because he felt the $5 tip the customer left wasn't enough compensation for the time and distance he drove. Now, obviously, stealing is wrong and the driver was fired, but the incident really highlighted the core systemic problem that drivers' base pay from DoorDash was likely incredibly low. These platforms use algorithms designed to minimize their payout, so he felt utterly dependent on that tip to make the delivery worthwhile at all.
So the system kind of sets it up so the worker and the customer are fighting each other, and it takes the focus off the company that's setting those low base pay rates in the first place.
It's a really effective deflection tactic when you think about it. The company pays the bare minimum, maybe less. Then the worker, often out of desperation, confronts the customer over what they see as a low tip. All the public discussion then focuses on, oh, that worker is so entitled, or that customer is so cheap. And the platform itself, whether it's DoorDash, Uber, Instacart, they completely sidestep any scrutiny about their own pay structure, which is often the root cause of the conflict.
And this reliance on tips is so baked in now that even workers who are organizing, who are unionizing, are actually fighting over tips as a key issue. You mentioned the Starbucks union drives being linked to this.
Yeah, that was a really interesting example. When Starbucks workers started campaigning to unionize, one of their specific demands, a key bargaining point, was getting the ability to accept tips via credit card. Because as society moved away from cash towards cards and apps, these baristas were literally losing out on a significant traditional part of their income stream. They needed that back. And then, when Starbucks corporate did finally agree to roll out credit card tipping across the company, they initially tried to withhold it specifically from the stores that had already voted to unionize. It just goes to show how critical tips have become not just as income for the workers, but as a powerful lever of corporate control and a really central point in labor negotiations.
Okay, we've established pretty clearly that technology is a major driver, maybe the major driver, of this tipflation phenomenon. Let's look a bit closer now at the actual mechanics. How does this technology of guilt, as you called it, really work on us psychologically?
Well, that digital tablet, it's more than just convenient. It's really a finely tuned piece of psychological engineering aimed at maximizing revenue for the business. We already talked about the visibility factor, the employee watching. But beyond that, it leverages our cognitive shortcuts, our desire for things to be easy. By making no tip an active choice you have to select, it creates what behavioral scientists call an awkward option. The path of least resistance, the easiest, smoothest thing to do is just tap that pre-selected 20% button and move on.
And the fact that those pre-selected buttons themselves seem to have crept up plays a huge role too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The old standard, maybe 15%, you barely see that as the lowest option anymore. Now, the defaults often start at 18% or 20% or even 25%, especially in cities with a higher cost of living. Think about it. For a quick $5 coffee, hitting that 25% default adds another $1.25. It doesn't feel like a lot in the moment for that one transaction. It seems negligible, but it adds up incredibly fast across dozens of small purchases.
And that brings up the other psychological piece, the effect of contactless payments. It feels different than handing over actual cash. When I pull a dollar bill out of my wallet, I feel that money leaving.
That physical connection, or lack thereof, is really key. When you just tap a card or wave your phone, you're kind of removed from the physical act of spending money. The whole transaction feels smooth, frictionless, almost invisible. And often, our desire for that quick, seamless experience overrides our instinct to be careful with our spending. We subconsciously prioritize making the interaction quick and painless over scrutinizing every dollar, and companies absolutely know this and design their systems to exploit that behavioral bias.
Okay, now we need to tackle what might be the single biggest source of consumer frustration and distrust right now. All these different fees and charges popping up. We really need to simplify this. What is the crucial difference between a voluntary tip and one of those mandatory service charges we're seeing more and more?
Yeah, this lack of clarity, this sort of procedural unfairness, it's becoming toxic. It's leading to confusion, resentment, even class action lawsuits in some cases. So let's define them simply. A tip or gratuity is supposed to be voluntary. And crucially, under U.S. labor law, that money legally belongs to the employee or employees, although there are complex rules about how it can be pooled or shared among staff. But fundamentally, it's worker money.
Okay, so that's a tip. What about the service charge?
A service charge is different. It's a mandatory fee added directly to your bill by the establishment. It might be a percentage, often 18% or 20%, or sometimes a flat fee. And it comes with all sorts of vague names, right? Administrative fee, wellness fee, kitchen appreciation fee, health insurance surcharge. The absolute key difference is this. Legally, the business owner gets to decide what happens to that money. They are not legally required to distribute it to the staff. So that service charge might go towards covering employee benefits or paying back-of-house staff, or maybe it just goes straight to the business's bottom line as general revenue or profit. The business decides.
And this is where we get into that horrible double tipping situation people complain about.
Exactly. The customer sees, say, a 20% service fee already added to their check. They have no idea if that money actually went to the server standing in front of them. Then the payment terminal still flips around, prompting them for an additional voluntary tip on top of the service fee. And out of confusion or maybe guilt or just not wanting to seem cheap, they end up tipping again. It's this complete lack of transparency, not knowing if the service fee replaces the tip, or if it's just padding the owner's pockets while you're still expected to tip the worker directly, that breeds so much distrust. It's why you're seeing this growing public and political pushback against what people are calling junk fees. Consumers are demanding clarity. They just want to know where their money is actually going.
Okay, let's pivot slightly and talk about fairness and equity. The tipping system is often defended with this idea that it's meritocratic, right? You provide good service, you get rewarded with a good tip. But the research we looked at suggests it's really not that simple. Tipping isn't purely based on merit, is it?
No, not at all. This is where the social science really challenges that industry narrative. When researchers actually study equity, fairness, and tipping, the data consistently shows something else is going on. Gratuity levels often reflect the customer's biases, conscious or unconscious, far more than they reflect objective service quality. Things like the server's race, their gender, maybe how attractive the customer finds them, even their accent. All these factors have been shown to significantly influence tip amounts, regardless of the actual service provided. This means two workers doing the exact same job, delivering the exact same quality of service, can end up with vastly different incomes just based on who they are and how customers perceive them.
And the system also seems to systematically under-reward certain roles, the ones that aren't customer-facing. The invisible workers.
Absolutely. Think about the back-of-house staff in a restaurant, the line cooks, the prep cooks, the dishwashers. In most traditional tipping structures, they get none of the tips, even though they're the ones actually creating the entire product you're consuming. That barista's frustration you sometimes hear about is a perfect example of this disconnect. They're performing visible, skilled labor, crafting your drink right in front of you. Yet, consumers often question tipping them because traditional tipping etiquette was built around the dedicated sit-down server, not the person actually making the product at the counter. So the tipping structure itself reinforces this divide, funneling the high-risk, potentially high-reward, but volatile income to the front of house while keeping the back of house on lower but maybe more stable, non-tipped wages. It creates inherent inequities.
The long-term impact of all this bias, how it affects people's careers and lifetime earnings, that feels like a really crucial area where we need more understanding. Let's frame this as our first key knowledge gap for you, the listener, to think about. To what extent does unconscious bias in tipping behavior actually influence the lifetime earnings and career trajectories of service workers, and how does this compare across diverse worker populations? Really understanding that human cost seems vital.
And if we zoom out for a moment, look beyond the U.S., we see a stark international contrast. It really highlights how unusual and maybe problematic the American system is. Most other developed countries have largely looked at the U.S. model and said, no, thank you, for precisely the reasons we've been discussing.
Right. In most of Europe or Australia, Japan,
Mhm.
service is just included in the price, isn't it?
Exactly. The price you see on the menu is expected to cover the full cost of producing that meal, including paying the staff a proper wage. Tipping is either completely absent, or it's a very small, genuinely discretionary gesture, maybe rounding up the bill, or leaving 5%, perhaps 10% maximum reserved only for truly outstanding, above and beyond service. It is fundamentally not viewed as a mandatory subsidy needed to make up the worker's basic wage. The expectation is simply that the business pays a living wage from its revenue.
But the sources we reviewed sounded a warning bell. They suggested that this American model, the one with all its issues, is starting to be exported, driven by global chains and payment apps.
Yes, unfortunately. American tech companies and large restaurant chains are actively pushing aggressive tipping prompts and U.S.-style expectations into markets like Canada, the UK, even Australia, places where stable service wages and minimal tipping were the long-standing norm. There's a real palpable fear among consumer advocates and labor groups in those countries that the system designed primarily to minimize U.S. labor costs, leveraging wage exploitation and guilt tactics, is now starting to erode those global standards. They worry it's creating an unnecessary financial burden and psychological pressure for international consumers who aren't used to it, and potentially undermining wage structures there, too. Hashtag check for future implications and alternatives.
Okay, it seems pretty clear the current system, as it stands, is generating a lot of friction. Massive consumer distrust on one side, huge income volatility for workers on the other. It feels unsustainable. Since the status quo doesn't seem to be working well for hardly anyone, we have to look at the alternatives. What are the main policy proposals out there for actually changing this tipping economy? Our sources detailed about three main paths.
Right. The first alternative is probably the most fundamental and maybe the most disruptive, and the sub-minimum tipped wage entirely.
Okay, so what does that mean in practice?
Hmm.
Just pay everyone the full standard minimum wage that applies in their area, regardless of whether they might also receive tips. Make tips truly optional, a real bonus again.
Exactly that. The potential benefits are pretty significant. You get guaranteed income stability for workers, which is huge. You'd eliminate that weird tax trap we talked about. And it could potentially reduce the impact of customer bias on earnings because the base wage is secure. It gives workers a stable financial floor to stand on. But the downsides, or at least the challenges, are also pretty clear. It means an immediate, potentially significant jump in direct labor costs for employers, especially restaurants. And that likely means higher menu prices or the introduction of those service fees we just discussed.
We have seen some places actually do this already, right? Cities like Seattle, Washington, D.C., the whole state of California.
Yeah.
They've moved towards this one fair wage model. What do the results look like in the real world?
Yeah, it's been a kind of natural experiment. Studies looking at those places have generally found that the dire predictions from the industry, mass restaurant closures, huge job losses, they mostly didn't happen on the scale predicted. Now, some restaurants certainly faced challenges, and prices did tend to go up to cover the higher labor costs. But overall, employment levels in the sector remained relatively stable, and surveys often show worker satisfaction improving because their income is more predictable. The main pushback continues to come from powerful industry lobbying groups like the National Restaurant Association, who fight very hard to keep the tipped minimum wage system in place because it demonstrably lowers their members' direct labor costs.
Okay, so that's one path. What's the second alternative? This is one we sometimes see at maybe higher-end restaurants already. Service-included pricing.
Right. This model tackles it from the pricing side. The restaurant calculates its true costs, including paying all staff a higher stable wage or even a salary, and then builds that entire cost into the menu prices up front. They then communicate very clearly to customers. Service is included. Gratuity is not necessary or expected. This approach offers maximum predictability for the staff's income and completely eliminates any confusion or awkwardness for the customer at payment time.
That sounds pretty clean. But I can imagine it might create issues for certain types of workers, maybe the really high earners in the current system.
It definitely can. The biggest hurdle is often that initial sticker shock for consumers seeing the higher menu prices, even if they end up paying the same total amount. But the other challenge is for those top-tier servers, maybe working in very busy, expensive restaurants, who currently earn enormous amounts through tips. Shifting them to a fixed salary, even a generous one, might actually result in lower overall take-home pay compared to what they could make under the old tipping model on a really good night. So for this model to work and retain top talent, the service included wage or salary needs to be set high enough to be genuinely competitive with the potential high earnings from tips, and that can be tough for a restaurant's profit margins.
All right. And then there's the third option, the one that's been getting some political attention lately, often pushed by more conservative figures. You mentioned Senator Cruz's bill, the No Tax on Tips Act. This is the idea of making tips tax-free.
Yeah, this proposal is quite different. It aims to make income received as tips exempt from federal income tax. It's important to note, though, that most versions of this proposal don't eliminate payroll taxes, the Social Security and Medicare contributions, just the income tax part. The appeal for its supporters is pretty straightforward. It gives workers an immediate, tangible boost in their net take-home pay without requiring businesses to change their wage structure or raise their prices. It looks like a simple, low-regulation way to help workers financially.
But does it actually fix the underlying problems we've been talking about? Does it solve the systemic issues?
No, not really. Dramatically not, according to most analysts looking at the system as a whole. While workers would certainly appreciate having more cash in their pocket each week, making tips tax-free actually reinforces the entire system's dependence on tipping. It does absolutely nothing to address the problem of income volatility from week to week. It does nothing to combat the impact of customer bias on earnings, and fundamentally it cements the core issue. The employer remains reliant on unpredictable customer generosity to fund a significant portion of their payroll. So critics see it as basically a short-term financial band-aid that distracts from, and maybe even prevents, addressing the deeper structural illness of an exploitative wage system.
Okay, so looking ahead, given all these tensions, these different potential paths, what trends should we, as consumers and observers, realistically expect to see emerging in the next few years around tipping?
Well, I think the most immediate and maybe most forceful trend will be the continued push for transparency. The backlash against hidden or confusing junk fees is really gaining steam. We can expect growing pressure from consumer groups, maybe even regulatory bodies like the FTC or state attorneys general, demanding much clearer, standardized disclosure about exactly where any mandatory service charge or fee is going. Customers are getting fed up. They increasingly want to know, is this 3% kitchen fee actually going to the cooks, or is it just boosting the owner's profit margin? That demand for clarity isn't going away.
And you also mentioned earlier we might see the service industry itself start to split more clearly into different models.
Yeah, I think we'll see a more pronounced bifurcation of venues. The restaurant and service landscape will likely continue to divide. You'll have establishments that double down on the traditional low-wage, high-tip model, maybe becoming even more aggressive with prompts. And then you'll have others that proactively decide to shift to service-included pricing or significantly higher base wages, and they'll advertise that difference as a selling point. This will probably force businesses to be much clearer in their signage and menu language about which system they're using. Tipping expected, service included, living wage establishment. That kind of clarity actually empowers consumers to choose the model they prefer to support, which is ultimately a good thing for fairness.
Before we wrap this all up, we identified a couple of key areas where we still need more information, more data, to really understand the best path forward. These are the knowledge gaps. We talked about the policy solutions like ending the tip minimum wage, but the real-world economic impacts are still debated. So let's state our second key question for listeners to ponder. If the tips minimum wage were universally abolished across the U.S., what would be the actual net effect on overall restaurant closure rates and total employment levels once you balance out the increased labor costs against potentially more stable worker income and spending? Getting reliable modeling on that is crucial for making good policy choices.
Absolutely agreed. And the third knowledge gap really comes out of that disturbing Dave app scandal and the whole issue of using technology to manipulate us psychologically. We need to figure out how to regulate that kind of exploitation without accidentally stifling useful innovation in payment systems. So the third question is, how might the FTC or maybe other consumer protection agencies develop smarter regulations to combat these digital guilt screens and deceptive fee structures like the ones Dave used without creating rules so broad that they hinder legitimate advances in payment technology? Finding that balance between consumer protection and innovation is really tricky. Hashtag tag outro.
Wow. This has been a really deep dive into the tipping tangle. I think the core takeaway for me is just how complex this is. Modern tipping isn't just about being polite anymore, is it? It's become this deeply embedded economic contract shaped by specific legal policies like the sub-minimum wage and turbocharged by payment technology.
Exactly. It's a system that, in many ways, is cleverly designed to offer a competitive advantage to businesses by letting them advertise lower prices. But it achieves that advantage often at the direct expense of consumer trust, through things like guilt-inducing screens and confusing fees, and definitely at the expense of workers, who are left facing income volatility and the potential impacts of bias.
So for you, the listener, maybe standing there right now facing that tablet, what's the practical advice? Based on the sources, here's a simple decision guide we can distill.
Okay, for a standard sit-down dining experience in the US, that 18% to 20% range is still generally the social expectation for decent service. However, always check your itemized bill first. Look carefully for any automatic gratuity or mandatory service charge that might have already been added, especially for larger parties. If the restaurant has already put, say, an 18% or 20% charge on there, do not feel obligated to add another full tip on top automatically. If you're unsure where that fee goes, ask your server or the manager for clarification before you pay.
Right. And what about all those other situations? The counter service, the coffee shop, the quick takeout order.
For those quick counter service type transactions, remember that tipping is fundamentally optional. While leaving a small fixed amount, maybe a dollar or two, is certainly appreciated, especially if someone provided significant help or customized your order, you are absolutely not obligated to hit those high percentage default buttons, 20%, 25%, for just handing over a pre-made item or pouring a coffee. You genuinely have the power to just tap no tip or custom and enter zero on that tablet without feeling guilty. It's your choice. And finally, if you do see a service charge, kitchen fee, wellness fee, whatever they call it, on your bill, look for clear language explaining exactly where that money is allocated. If the menu or the bill is vague, or if the staff can't clearly tell you that those funds are distributed directly to the employees as wages or bonuses, you should probably consider that a red flag. Try to prioritize businesses that are transparent and avoid contributing to systems that seem designed to obscure where your money goes.
Ultimately, it feels like all this friction we're experiencing over tipping, all the frustration and confusion, it might actually be a necessary, if uncomfortable, conversation. It's forcing us to ask, who should really bear the cost, and perhaps more importantly, the risk associated with paying people a fair, stable wage for their work? And while you as an individual can always choose to hit no tip on that tablet, the larger system itself probably won't change fundamentally until consumers start demanding more transparency and accountability directly from the companies, not just demanding better service from the individual workers caught in the middle. That feels like the crucial shift in focus we need.